Thank you, everybody. I'm going to jump straight in because I know we're slightly hungover and could do with lunch. So my presentation is about the process of research and practice behind the book design and production of texts of the Murty Classical Library of India. And it aims to offer some thoughts of how one might create a typographic design for contexts such as that of the Indian subcontinent. Some of this presentation was formed at Granshan and might be familiar to people who were there, and some of it has emerged since then. Now, the approach to book design was primarily shaped by the context of the text, historical as well as the future potential, and considerations of the various audiences. So half of my presentation will be talking about this, and then I'll jump into more detail about the concept and the design. So whilst this is a presentation about the Murty Library, it's also about the process of developing an approach to typography in the Indian context. So my broader aim is to show the relevance of this approach not just to India, not just to non-Latin, but more broadly to the practice of typography and book design. The Murty project has personal significance for me. I am Indian. I have my 25 documents and my Polish visa to prove it. I did my schooling and undergraduate in India, and Rohan Murty, who envisioned the Murty Library, was inspired by his own school education in India, as am I, and many Indians identify with it. So the text that Rohan and I studied in school were Shakespearean comedies and tragedies, poems from Wordsworth and Shelley, stories by Hardy and Kipling. Now, this is a rich heritage that contributed to a wealth of understanding about the world, but keenly missing from it was the opportunity to partake of my own heritage. So what of the classics at Harvard? As many of you may know, there's a long-standing tradition with the Loeb, the Itati, and the Dunbarton Oaks. When looking at the mission behind the classics at Harvard, I found that the original purpose that was set out in 1910 was aligned and sympathetic to the contemporary Murty cause. And this alignment began to suggest a starting point for our design. However, what really drew me to this project, besides the fabulousness that is Fiona Ross, was the context highlighted by three statements. The first was made by Professor Sheldon Pollock, who's the editor of the series, and identified a critical need to address a situation, or else Indians and all the rest of the world would not have access to this classical heritage. The second is described by two statements more than 50 years apart, which describe exactly the same situation. The first, by C.D. Deshmukh, refers to a lack of attention to printing and typographic conventions in India. The other is a more recent statement by an academic publisher in Chennai, where I'm from, and he loudly bemoans the lack of standards for typesetting modern Indian languages. I think you'll agree with me when I say that it's not enough now to have robust and beautiful typefaces when the intended users of these typefaces do not know or have fundamental guidelines by which to apply them. The third situation is a call to arms. Recently, the People's Linguistic Survey of India confirmed that over 300 languages have become extinct since India's independence. 70 years of independence, 300 languages extinct, is not what I would call progress. But times have changed, and there's plenty of good work being done by type designers, some of whom are in this room, and similarly with linguists through documentation. But true change and impact is only possible with the cooperation of the typographer and the graphic designer. In 2011, two guys, Jack Schultz and Timo Arnold, wrote about something they call change through making. And they noted that what we as designers need to keep in mind is that we can design the means through which design happens, challenging concepts, behaviors, and the means of production, as well as designing form. And the chance to be a part of the Murty Library project gave me the impetus for such an opportunity to begin to form a series of guidelines for Indian typography. I think it's important to clarify here what I mean by typography and why I say a typography rather than the typography. In a context such as India, where information is available in sort of pockets that ebb and flow, one needs to draw from various subject areas and to take what the wonderful Paul Stiff describes here as a social yet critical approach. And this project draws strength from visual culture, oral history, social anthropology, linguistics, manuscript studies, alongside typography and book history. Moving on to considerations. For the reasons of time, I'll speak about 5 of them, limiting myself solely to the interior design of the books. I must clarify that my role here is to design the text for readership in print and hopefully screen, whilst the incredible team that are Fiona and John Hudson are designing the typefaces. Now, the Murty Library is a funded 100-year publishing, research, and design project. I was 39 when this picture was taken, and in the year 2011, I will be 139 years old. I won't look as good as I did over there, and I will possibly still be producing 1 million documents for my Polish visa. But, jokes aside, I think it's essential that the system being created survives us, makes sense to the people beyond us, and provides whomever takes this on in the future with a strong foundation to build on. But here then is the challenge. As noted by Nancy Farris, how do you construct the past when you weren't around? And how do you plan for a future that is well beyond your lifetime? The key, I think, is to combine system with process. As Farris notes, systems fit parts together in a synchronic relationship explained by functionality, while process links them together sequentially through cause and effect. So the relationship of design has to be seen in motion, continually changing while remaining somewhat integrated. And I'll explain a little bit more about this as I go along. So one of the first tasks of the project was to find a compatible Latin typeface. And I was really interested in the Museum of Warsaw project, which had a long list of criteria. I won't say much more here due to time, except to say thanks to the many kind people, many of whom are here, who trusted us with their typefaces so we could conduct tests with them. So in addition to this criteria, I was also keen on a really robust typeface. We were printing both in America and in India, so it had to kind of flesh to very good printing conditions and somewhat not so good conditions, as well as tropical weather. So we selected a short list of typefaces using the criteria, and because we didn't have any Indic typefaces yet, we conducted tests with faces from different scripts with the values that we felt would work for this project. At this stage, the focus was on the comparative relationship of the Latin with the Indic, rather than any micro-typographic details. We chose Hendrix Antwerp, a classical and contemporary text typeface with historical references, generous X height, which allowed for reading on screen and print, multiple number styles, large set of ligatures and fractions, not large enough because I think John's expanded them further for the South Asian X, large punctuation, slightly inclined stems, and pronounced ink traps. As with good book faces, it could be set in small sizes. I'm not sure how much you could see there. And the series also adheres to very strict Indic conventions of a single weight. So the Latin needs to have a distinctive Roman and italic that had both flex and capacity. So whilst Fiona and John got on with the hard task of designing the Indic typefaces for the project, I started to build a book design concept. Earlier Harvard classics had to deal with 3 to 4 different languages at the most. The Murty task was to accommodate, at least at the starting mission, 13 different languages and relevant scripts. So the concept of unity and diversity is promoted in India and is exemplified in the national anthem written by Tagore. And this became a guiding principle for the interior design, to exemplify the best of the scripts, while at the same time being relevant to the needs of the larger series. So for the purpose of the book design, we divided the scripts into 3 subgroups, North, South, and Persia Arabic, and the aim was to establish typographic conventions that can be followed in the future. This takes the form of 2 templates, one for prose and one for poetry, and we continue to do a tremendous amount of archival research looking at manuscripts, early printed books in India, to give us a breadth and scope of knowledge, focusing in particular on the pre-1800 era. Now this consists not only of not looking at objects to mimic, but looking at historical objects while interrogating the context in which they were produced to understand the thinking and the practice better. It's also important to acknowledge that the history of the book tradition in India is not the codex, as many of you know. It's the scroll or the manuscript. So whilst Murty printed books on the form of the codex, the ambitions of the library are to provide digital access. So we did not want to get too stuck to the form of the codex in the design. Now, textual content is shaped by form, tools, materials, and technology. Modern printing, by its nature and birth, carries a Latin bias with it. The introduction of printing in India, for example, is tangled with colonial ambitions. And this is something that needs to be unraveled, though not discarded. Our research sought to unpack the details of the printed page and the scribed manuscript in the Indian context. Finally, we had to acknowledge the place of English in an Indian context where many Indians are bilingual and are used to seeing English accompany Indian languages even if they don't read it. And the Murty Library, importantly, aims to reach as wide an audience as possible. And this means people are coming to the text for purpose of study, but also for the pleasure of reading texts that are familiar to them through their childhood. So some of these readers will be fluent in the language, others might be second language speakers or third language speakers, or simply not know English at all. And it is absolutely essential that equal access is provided to all of these reader audiences. Now, the classical in India, unlike many other parts of the world, is actually a contemporary living concept. It's embedded in the culture. And the proposal aimed to bring this to life, that's evidenced, by the way, with the screensaver, by acknowledging the rich classical traditions of Indic literature in a contemporary setting. In our first meeting, Sharmila Sen, who was one of the editors of the series, described the design challenge by saying, "I want the girl in Delhi to read the Kamban Ramayana and the girl in Chennai to read Surdas." This was really useful because it reminded me of Indian classical music, where it enjoys a certain lack of boundaries and the enjoyment of the music is not limited by its origins. Now, in music, polyphony is a texture consisting of two or more independent melodic voices. The approach to the book design asked two questions. Can we design texts where the concept of symmetry is based on the scripts and the languages rather than the aesthetics? And can the content lead the form and still create a well-balanced design? Shown here are the different permutations and combinations possible. There's 6 different widths possible, which range from 234 to 288 points. While using one of the 6 different widths, the text box can be placed on the page in 28 different ways. As the 2 languages don't have to be the same width, further variations are possible. Ideally, every language and genre should use only one set of combinations that can be applied to subsequent texts, so this needs some forward thinking. Through flexibility of column widths, interlinear space, type size, the series design therefore provides for differing structures of text, including prose, poetry, mixed prose and poetry, and drama. It allows the arrangement of the original text and translation to their best internal logic, while providing a smooth and comfortable bilingual reading experience. To use the example of Devanagari Latin spread, the grid divides the page from an inner margin into multiples of 9 points. The grid allows for a 6 points difference between the base margin and the folio, and a text box of 28 units for the Latin and 22 for the Hindi. The positioning of the elements on the page varies according to languages and the length of the languages, and the system aims to highlight the nature of the text, but also put an emphasis on the intertextuality. So each page has a subtly different layout that is determined by the length of the Indian language and the text in relation to English, and the nature of the scripts to each other. So here the Hindi poem is set on 14 on 17.5, and 1.5 baseline measure to the Latin, which is 9 on 14. Here are 2 examples of South Indian languages. Often in multilingual design, I find that there's a push to try and find an exact sync or harmony between 2 very different scripts and writing systems. And this often obliterates their individual quirks and character. Here, the aim is to acknowledge the differences openly while trying to find a synchronicity between the 2. The history of Akbar is typeset by Titus using Nasim, and it's the first prose text of the series, and it brought particular challenges due to the length of languages. Here you could see how Titus has pushed the margins and template and tested it as far as he could to achieve a beautiful sync between the pages. We are used to working in economical constraints in design, and particularly people who work in Asia will understand this. This series is no different. So as noted with these typefaces, the series adheres strictly to classical text convention. There is no bold Indic, there is no slanted nonsense, thank goodness, and there are no other weights. So to keep the Latin on balance, we work with regular and italic weights of the Antwerp, and sometimes this limits what can be achieved with multiple typographic hierarchies. So we resort to color, and I'm not sure if you could see it, but one of the comment text on the right side is set in 80% gray. Achieving typographic compatibility is another challenge, particularly with complex footnotes. Now, the anticipation is that the reader of these notes, because no sane person will want to read these notes, is either a high-level scholar or a student who is studying the text, and essentially someone who wants a no-nonsense, comfortable reading. I always feel a bit of creative tension when designing the setting because of the anticipation of the future, but also the pressure of the past. We're also aware of the different audiences, the origins of the text, which are sometimes oral, whilst also trying to stay relevant to the different readers and audiences, so both scholarly and not. And the balance we're trying to achieve was captured by a review recently of one of the texts, the Epic of Ram. I wouldn't ask you to read the whole thing, but I think it's important to look at the second paragraph, because Rupert Snell, who's an eminent professor of Asian studies, acknowledges something really important here, that some of the practices we follow today are because we're comfortable with them, because they appear around us in daily life, and not because of a genuine history. And this is important for both type design and for typography. Snell goes on to say that he, as a scholar, huffed and puffed for a while at the radical change in layout, and then realized that the reason for the setting is that it greatly facilitates the dual reading of the text and the translation. And for me as a book designer, that's no better praise than that. So where are we now? We're just sending season 3 to print. It's on the machines right now. And we have done, I think, Pali, Sanskrit, Hindi, Kannada, Telugu, Bengali, Gurmukhi. And ahead of us are new challenges with Sindhi, I'm looking at you, Titus, and Tamil, amongst others. And where are we going? To conclude, a couple of things. First, if we are to get somewhere, we need to change our way of thinking. And the term non-Latin is a useful one because it sets things in historical context. I spoke earlier of the Latin bias in the origins of printing in South Asia. But how relevant is the term now, not Latin, to us in a global culture and practice? As Sheldon Pollock notes, if our understanding of truthfulness, of usefulness and truth has grown substantially, if we have learned that we are no longer to be judged by the metrics of colonialism and capitalist modernity. Second, we need to get out of our head that non-Latin is troublesome or unique. These descriptions are distracting. We need to pay attention to what we can learn from different cultural practices and what can be learned from them, not just for non-Latin, but for typography or type design as a whole. Perhaps then we will have a field that is more evenly distributed. And perhaps then, when I'm typesetting Bengali like I am now, might actually be able to work with a shaping engine that displays the font accurately. Third, Sheldon Pollock here talks about the values embedded in Indian culture and everyday life. Won't bother to read the whole thing, but I draw your eyes to the last 2 lines, where he talks about us embedding good practice. But good practice is also about questions, new questions, sometimes disruptive questions, that show us that the world was different and, importantly, can be still different. Finally, does it matter who does what? You don't need to be Indian to contribute to India's typographic landscape. Typefaces don't carry colors with them. It is we who apply those colors to them. Let me be blunt. Why does it matter if it's a white guy or gal working on a brown script typeface or the other way around? if he is knowledgeable and suited and approaches the task with depth, rigor, interrogation, and integrity, and knowledge of the script and how it reads. 5, it's important in this day of us moving and shifting that we must first hold on to our specialisms and engage in dialogue with those who are not in our discipline, learn from these conversations, and find mutual meeting points. The biggest success of the Murty Classical Library is that it's an effort by experts across the world: editors, publishers, writers, typeface designers, proofreaders, translators, graphic designers, printers, and binders. Each is a specialist working for a cause that's larger than themselves. And finally, for me, a mission which lay embedded at the end of Rupert Snell's review, who noted, readers and scholars may endlessly debate the detail of this and that, but when all is said and done, we have in these volumes an excellent rendering, a fine new version for our time. So I leave you with this thought and this plea. I think typography, in my experience, and it may be so for you, has today been a discipline and a profession of territories, whereas in practice, my experience that it's really a series of networks and of dialogue. And this is where that meeting of system and process can help. And this will be our approach in the building and sharing of typographic guidelines for South Asian scripts in the Indian subcontinent. What better aim could there be for a typography for India? Thank you very much.